Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to NWA'S Wonder. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to cut a vintage shirt. You all know that a vintage shirt is a shirt that always comes with a pattern. It's called beachwear sometimes, and then I'm going to be showing you how to cut it the right way. So I'm going to be using a pattern master, a tape, a scissors, and a biro. I'm going to be using a biro, a pen rather, because it's a flowery material that has pattern, and I think a chalk would just not do it. Like if I use a chalk, you might not see what I am doing, right? So I prefer to use a pen at this stage. So the first thing to do would be to fold my fabric into two. I already folded it into two. You can see I folded it into two, and there's a pattern I'm trying to follow with this fabric. There's a pattern I'm trying to follow. So I have 2 yards here. I have 2 yards. 1.5 yards would do, but I just have 2 yards because there's a pattern I'm trying to follow, right? You understand? So the next thing I'm going to do is to fold in the edge of my fabric by 4.5 inches. I'm going to fold in the edge of my fabric by 4.5 inches. Now the reason for folding in the edge of my fabric is because I do not want the back or the wrong side of my fabric to show when I fold in the neck of the vintage. So I need to fold it in by 4.5 inches, and make sure that I measure it with my tape to make sure it's up to 4.5 inches. You could do 4 inches, you could do 4.5, you could do 5, but never less than 4 inches. So I'm going to iron it out like so. So you want to make sure that you are using the same measurement from top to bottom. If you are using 4.5 inches, make sure it's 4.5 inches from top to bottom. Do not do 4 inches and then do 4.5 inches. Make sure it's straight. After ironing it out, the next thing I'm going to do is to make sure I was able to maintain the 4.5 inches from top to bottom. So I'm going to be using my tape to make sure I was able to maintain it. I'm doing this because a vintage fabric is always slippery, so you want to make sure you maintain it from top to bottom. The next thing I'm going to do is to fold in the other side of my fabric by 4.5 inches. I folded in one part by 4.5 inches, and now it's time to do the same thing for the other side by 4.5 inches. So you could use the ghetto line in the front to do this, or you could just choose to measure out 4.5 inches with your tape. I'm going to be doing it with my tape. I'm going to be measuring out 4.5 inches and ironing it out like so. Again, I'm going to be measuring to be making sure that I was able to maintain the 4.5 inches. You know, the difference between tailors and already made is that we don't just take our time to do these things. The little things that matter, we don't take our time to do them. We just rush through it, and then we're asking ourselves why we don't charge as much as they do, right? So after folding the two sides in by 4.5 inches, the next thing I'm going to do is to use a pin to hold my fabric in place. So I'm going to be using a pin to hold it in place. I'm going to use a pin because a vintage fabric is always slippery. It is always slippery, and if I don't hold it in place, I might find out that it's busy moving when I am trying to cut it out. I might find out that one side moved, or it's not just aligning like I intended it to. So I'm going to use a pin. I'm going to be using a pin, an office pin, to hold in the front of my fabric in place. I'm going to be pinning the folded part of my fabric. I'm not going to be pinning all the parts of my fabric, just the folded parts, because like I said, a vintage fabric is slippery. So as you can see, the front part of my fabric, or the folded part of my shirt, is aligning. The folded part of a vintage shirt is aligning correctly, right? So the next thing I'm going to do would be to rule a straight line at the bottom of my fabric. Now I'm going to be ruling a straight line from this part because there's a pattern I'm trying to follow on this fabric. So I'm not going to be using all the lengths. I'm just going to be ruling a straight line from where my pattern is going to be stopping. Right, I'm just going to be ruling a straight line from where the pattern is going to be stopping. I was supposed to use all the length of my fabric. That is, I'm supposed to be ruling a line at the bottom of this fabric, but then I'm trying to follow a particular pattern. The next thing I'm going to do would be to apply the length of my shirt. Now, from the line I just ruled, I'm going to be applying the length of my shirt. The length of this shirt is 30 inches. I'm going to be placing my tape at 30 and a half inches. Sorry, the length of this shirt is 30 and a half inches. I'm going to be placing my tape at 30 and a half inches all through. So from the line I just ruled at the bottom, I'm going to place my tape at 30 and a half inches. Notice I'm not adding any allowance to the length of my shirt. For now, I'm not adding any allowance to the length of my shirt. So the length of this shirt is 30 and a half inches, and I'm marking my chalk, I'm marking my pen at exactly 30 and a half inches. I'm not adding any allowance, not even an inch. At this point, you do not need to add an allowance, and I'm going to explain why later on in this video. So the next thing to do after placing the length of my shirt, the next thing to do would be to apply the breadth of my shirt, or to place the chest measurement for this shirt. Now the chest measurement of this shirt is 40 inches. I'm going to be dividing 40 by 4. So 40 divided by 4 is going to give me 10 inches, right? I'm going to be placing 10 inches from the beginning of my fabric. I'm going to be placing 10 inches, and then I'm going to add 1 inch for overlapping allowance, and then I'm going to add another 1 inch for sewing allowance. I placed 10 inches, which is my chest divided by 4, right? And then I added 1 inch for overlapping, and then I added 1 inch for sewing allowance. I'm going to be doing the same thing here just so you can see. I'm going to divide my chest by 4, and I'm going to place 10 inches here. I'm going to add 1 inch for overlapping allowance, and then I'm going to add another 1 inch for sewing allowance. So I'm going to be doing the same thing at the bottom. I'm going to place my tape at the bottom. I'm going to place my tape at 10 inch, and then I'm going to add 1 inch for overlapping allowance, and then I'm going to add 1 inch for sewing allowance. After that, I'm going to use my ruler to rule a straight line across. Now if you notice, I have 12 inches here instead of 10 inches. I have 12 inches like this, so I'm going to be using a ruler to rule a straight line across. So after using a straight ruler to rule a straight line across like so, the next thing I'm going to do is to slant the shoulder of my shirt. I'm going to be slanting the shoulder of my shirt because a human shoulder is not straight, it is slanted. So from the first pen mark that is there, from the 10-inch mark, I'm going to be coming down by 2.5 inches. From the 10-inch mark, or from the first pen mark, I'm going to be coming down by 2.5 inches, and then I'm going to slant these 2.5 inches to the front of my fabric. So using the straight part of my ruler, I'm going to slant that 2.5 inches to the front part of my fabric like so. So that's it about cutting the front part of a vintage shirt or a beachwear shirt. That's it about cutting out the front part. So the next thing I'm going to do would be to cut out the neck and the armhole, but I'm going to be doing that when cutting the back. For now, I'm just going to be cutting out the front of my fabric like so. I want you to notice that I have not taken out the pins. The pins I placed in the front of my shirt, it's still there, and I'm going to be leaving it there until I'm done cutting the back. Now to cut the back, what I'm going to do is still to fold my fabric into two, but then this fabric is too wide, right? The breadth of this fabric is wide. It's 60 inches. A vintage shirt is 60 inches in breadth, so the wideness of a vintage shirt is usually 60 inches. I'm talking about the fabric now. It's usually 60 inches, so I need to reduce it. So what I'm going to do is to make sure I have 12 inches. Remember, for the front, the total measurement that we had at the front was 12 inches. So I'm just going to make sure I have 12 inches here, even though I'm not going to be using all of it. I'm just going to make sure I have 12 inches to be on the safe side. As you can see, I have 12 inches. I'm going to be using an iron to bring out the midpoint of the back of my shirt. I'm going to be using an iron to do it like so. So I hope you can see how the midpoint of my shirt or the midpoint of my fabric is. You have to take your time to iron it out at this point, and if you can iron it out, then I think 50 to 60% of your work is done by just ironing. So the next thing I'm going to do is to place the front on the back. I'm going to place the front of the shirt on the back of the shirt and make sure it is overlapping by 1 inch. I'm going to make sure that the front, if you remember, I took out 1 inch. When placing the measurement at my front, I placed 1 inch for overlapping, and then I placed 1 inch for sewing allowance. So I'm going to be bringing out that 1 inch for overlapping at the front. I'm going to say it again. When measuring the front of my shirt, I added 2 inches allowance. 1 inch was for the overlapping and the other inch was for sewing allowance. So what I'm doing now is making sure that the 1 inch for the overlapping is coming out at the front. I'm making sure that the front of my vintage shirt is overlapping on the back by 1 inch, not more than 1 inch, because if you use more than 1 inch, then you're just going to end up hurting your measurement. The next thing I'm going to do is to trace out the shoulder for the back of my shirt using my scissors and the front like so. When I'm done tracing it out, the next thing I'm going to do would be to pull down the front of my shirt. I'm going to pull down the front of my vintage shirt and then make sure that the back of my shirt is taller than the front. While pulling it down, I'm trying to maintain the overlapping, the 1 inch overlapping that I just did. I'm trying to maintain it. So that is the trick when cutting a vintage shirt or when cutting a button down plaid shirt. You have to make sure that it is overlapping by 1 inch. You have to maintain it when cutting it out. So the back of the shirt is always longer than the front by 4 inch. For a matured male, it is always longer than the front by 4 inch. So I say the matured male, it could be for an average male, I use 4 inch, right? The back of the shirt should be longer than the front by 4 inch. That is, the distance between their shoulders should be 4 inches. For a hefty person, you could do 4.5, but I've not done 5, so it's either 4 inches or 4.5 inches. So I'm going to make sure that the back of the shirt is taller than the front of the shirt by 4 inches. After making sure it is taller than 4 inches and still making sure that my overlapping is still where it is supposed to be, I'm just going to cut out the excess. I'm going to cut out the excess just so that we can concentrate on what is important, because all this excess fabric, it's just, I don't like it, so let's cut it out. If you are enjoying this video, if you are learning and getting value from this video, then help us by clicking on the like button, just so that YouTube knows that this is a great video and it keeps recommending it to people across the world. So help us by clicking on the like button. Thank you. Now the next thing I'm going to do will be to make sure that the shoulder of the back of my shirt is overlapping on the front by ½ inch. I'm going to make sure that the shoulder of the back of my shirt is overlapping on the front by ½ inch, no more than ½ inch, because this ½ inch is going to serve as my sewing allowance on the shoulder. Now I'm going to make sure it's overlapping by ½ inch, and then I'm going to iron it out. Now a lot of people will just tell you to use 3.3, or they'll bring up some would I say format or formulas that they use, but then I found that this is the easiest. Bringing out the sewing allowance on the shoulder is better than measuring out the neck and then going on to cut it out when sewing the shoulder. It's better you make it to overlap like this and then cut out your neck. Do you understand? So the next thing I'm going to do would be to place my neck measurement. Guys, I've shown you how to cut the neck of a shirt, and the video is right there in the description box of this video. You can click on it to see how to calculate the neck of your shirt. But for this one, I'm going to come down from the ghetto line at the back of my shirt. I'm going to come down by 4.5 inches from this ghetto line. From the ghetto line, I'm going to come down by 4.5 inches, and then I'm going to place the breadth of my neck starting from the midpoint of my back. The breadth of my neck is going to start from the midpoint of my back. That means I'm going to ignore the overlapping at the front. I'm just going to start it from the back. So the breadth of this neck is 2.3 inches. I'm starting it from the midpoint of the back. I'm going to ignore the overlapping at the front, ignore that 1 inch, and just place your measurement from the midpoint of the back. The next thing I'm going to do would be to use a pattern master to curve out the line of my neck. You could use a freehand, but if you have a pattern master or a French curve, then that's better. So like I said, ignore the overlapping on the front and just place your measurements, the breadth of your neck. Just place the breadth of your neck from the midpoint of the back. Ignore the overlapping in the front of your shirt and place your measurements from the midpoint of the back. For the back neck, or for the neck of the back of your shirt, the next thing I'm going to do would be to add 0.8 inches to the 2 and 3 inches. So I'm going to add 0.8 inches, which is going to give me 3 inches. I'm going to mark my chalk at 3 inches, and then I'm going to curve it from the ghetto line. Right, I added 0.8 inches, which gave me 3 inches, and then I'm going to roll a straight line at the 3 inches. The breadth of the front was 2.3 inches. I added 0.8 inches. It gave me 3 inches. I rolled the line, and then from now I'm curving it from that ghetto line. I hope you can see the ghetto line, and I hope you can see what I am curving. So I'm going to make sure I curve it from that ghetto line, just so that that is where the curve is supposed to start really. So I'm going to cut out the front. So you just want to add 0.8 inches to the breadth of your neck. So if the breadth of the front was 2.5 inches, you added 0.8 inches, it will still give you 3.3 inches. For this one, it gave me 3 inches. So I'm going to cut out the one for the back too, just so that you can see how it sits. You can see that it's stopping at the ghetto line, and then you can see how the neck is aligning, right? That is that about cutting the neck of a vintage shirt, or how to cut the neck for a plaid shirt. Now this measurement I used on this neck, I calculated it myself, and I showed you how to do that in the video in the description box of this video, so do check it out. Now you can see how the neck is aligning. This would not give you a problem. If your neck is always folding or looking smallish, then if you use this pattern I just used, or this method I just used, it is not going to give you that problem. The next thing I'm going to do is to place the shoulder of my shirt. Now the shoulder of this shirt is 20 inches. 20 inches, I'm going to be dividing it by 2. 20 inches divided by 2 is going to give me 10 inches. So I'm going to mark my chalk at 10 inches. And then I'm going to add 0.5 inches for sewing allowance. I place my chalk at 10 inches, and then I'm going to add 0.5 inch for sewing allowance. The next thing I'm going to do would be to roll a straight line from that 0.5 inch down. After rolling a straight line, I'm going to calculate my armhole. Now the armhole, to calculate the armhole, what you need to do is to divide your chest into 6 and then add 1.5 inch. Your chest divided by 6 plus 1.5 inch will give you your armhole. To put that into perspective, the chest of this shirt, like I told you, is 40. 40 divided by 6 is around 6.7 inches, plus 1.5 inches is going to give me 8.1 inches. I'm going to mark my pen at 8.1 inch. So the armhole of your shirt, the easiest way to get your armhole is to divide your chest by 6 and then add 1.5 inches. You divide your chest by 6 and add 1.5 inches. The next thing I'm going to do is to divide this by 2. So I divided 8.1 by 2, which, like you know by now, if you're watching my video, is just to break my tape into 2. If you want to divide it with your calculator, fine and good, but you're going to get the same thing. I got 4.8 0.1 inch. So I'm going to come at that midpoint of my armhole and I'm going to come in by 1.3 inches. From that midpoint of my armhole, remember I divided my armhole by 2, so I came in by 1.3 inches. And then now I'm going to be using my armhole curve to curve out my armhole. You could use a pattern master, you could use a freehand, but I found that an armhole curve is just better. So I'm going to be using my armhole to join those lines from the half inch to the midpoint and then to the down, from the half inch to the midpoint and then to the bottom of the armhole. You have to make sure that it is well placed so that you can balance it and roll a line across quickly. So the reason I came in by 1.3 inches at the midpoint of my armhole is simply because I need to deepen it like that so that I will avoid those folding that senators wear or shirts in general usually have at their armhole, right? You notice this folding that they have, it's like it's clutching your client on his breast or something. So I deepened it enough so that it would not clutch and it would not be excess. So the next thing I'm going to do would be to measure out the circumference of my armhole, and then I'm going to write it down on a book just so that I can remember it. So I'm going to measure it out. It's giving me 10.8 inch. So I'm going to write down 10.8 inches on a notebook so I can remember, and I'm going to use that measurement, that 10.8 inch, to cut the hand of this shirt in a moment. The next thing I'm going to do would be to cut out the armhole like so. So that is that about cutting the vintage shirt, about cutting a vintage shirt. So I'm going to show you the length. Remember, I did not add any allowance in the length of this shirt when cutting, so I'm going to show you just so that you know that I have more than enough allowance. Now the length of this shirt is 30.5 inches and this is 32 inches, so I have around 1.5 inch for folding. I have 1.5 inch allowance to hem it. So you want to make sure that you don't have excess and you want to make sure that you don't have too little. Too much is bad and too little is bad, so you want to make sure that you have just enough. The next thing to do is to cut out the hand of this shirt. It is to cut out the hand of this shirt, and I'm folded it into two, right? After folding it into two, I'm going to get the midpoint with my iron. So for the armhole, for the hand of this shirt, the next thing I'm going to do, or the first thing I'm going to do, is to roll a straight line for at the top of the armhole. I'm going to roll a straight line at the top of the sleeve. Why do I keep calling it armhole? So I'm going to roll a straight line at the top of the sleeve, and then the next thing I'm going to do would be to place the length of my armhole. Now I just have to bring this shirt so that I can jog our minds back to memory lane a bit, right? So I can take us back memory lane a bit. So to measure the length of this armhole, what it's become now, you can see it is 8.5 inches. You can see it is 8.5 inches. So it's always advisable to use the shirt to cut the armhole. So what I'm going to do is to place a pen at 8.5 inches. So I'm going to mark my pen. As you can see, I'm going to mark my pen at 8.5 inches. I hope you can see. So I took out the shirt already. After placing my pen at 8.5 inches, just like I did on the armhole, I'm going to be dividing this by 2, which for me is just breaking the tape into 2 like so, and then marking my pen at the midpoint. If you want to use your calculator, fine. You are still going to get the same thing, which is going to give you 4.3 inches, right? You can see it is 4.3 inches. The next thing I'm going to do would be to come in by 2 inches at the tip of my armhole. I'm going to come in by 2 inches. After coming in by 2 inches, I'm going to roll a line there just so that you can see. And then at the midpoint of my armhole, I'm going to come down by 1.3 inch. Remember, at my shirt, I came in by 1.3 inches, right? I have to do the same thing on my hand. I came down by 1.3 inch. Not more than 1.3 inch. Whatever you did on your shirt, do it here. So I divided it by 2. I came to the midpoint and I added 1.3 inches, right? And then at the tip of the armhole, what I'm going to do is to come down by 5.5 inches. I'm going to come down by 5.5. Please do not do more than 6, right? No matter how you want to deepen this part, it shouldn't be more than 6. You can do 5, you can do 5.5, you can do 6, but no more than 6, because the deeper that place is, the shorter your hand gets. And especially in long sleeve, when you're making long sleeve, you notice that you measured your hand, let's say it's 25, you measured 25, right? And then when you finish sewing, you deepened in this place too much, and then you just see that your hand shorts. Your hand does not even get to where you wanted it to get to, and you're asking yourself, how come? So I've noticed that the deeper you make this place, the shorter your hand gets, the shorter your sleeve gets. The deeper this place gets, the shorter your sleeves get. So I'm going to use my pen to merge all this line like so, and what you just need to do is to look at how I'm doing it and then do the same thing. So please do not deepen in that place by more than 6 inches. Do not deepen it by more than 6 inches, because the deeper this place gets, the shorter your sleeve gets. So the next thing to do would be to measure the circumference of this hand. I'm going to measure the circumference of this sleeve. So just like I did on the shirt again, I'm just going to take it easy at this point and measure out the circumference of this sleeve. Now I'm going to place it at 11.5 inch. I'm going to place it at 11.5 inch because the hand or the armhole increased. You can see that we made the length 8.1 initially, but now it is 8.5. So I'm going to place it at 11.5 inch, and then I'm going to place the length of my sleeve. The length of this sleeve is 11 inch. I hope you can see. The length of this sleeve is 11 inch. So I'm going to mark a chalk at 11 inch, and then I'm going to rule a straight line like so. The next thing I'm going to do is to come down by 2.5 inch. I'm going to come down by 2.5 inch from the length of my sleeve, and that 2.5 inch is going to serve as the folding allowance for the sleeve of my vintage wear. Alright, I'm going to come down by 2.5 inch just like I did at the sleeve of my vintage wear, and then I'm going to rule a straight line from that 2.5 inch. I hope you can see the line I am ruling. I know you say that I will no longer use a flowery material, but then I had no choice, right? I had no choice here. So the next thing I'm going to do is to place the circumference of the hand and then add 1 inch. The circumference of this hand was 16. I divided 16 by 2. 16 divided by 2 gave me 8. I placed 8 and then I added 1 inch, and then I'm going to slant it from that 11.5 to the circumference of my neck. So I slanted it from the armhole to the circumference of my hand, and then the next thing I'm going to do would be to make sure that I rule a straight line at the folding allowance of my sleeve, right? So that is it basically on how to cut the sleeve. So I'm going to place a notch at the top of the sleeve, and I think that's it on how to cut the sleeve of a vintage wear. I have to take this away real quick, and then I'm going to show you just what the sleeve looks like. So the next thing I'm just going to do is to place it on the fabric and then trace out the second sleeve, right? Please make sure you weave before you sew, or rather anyone you want to do, but just make sure that you weave it while sewing, just so that it can come out neat. I left 2 videos for you in the description box of this video. The first one, I showed you how to cut and calculate the neck of a shirt perfectly like a professional. The second one, I showed you how to make a collar for a plaid shirt. But before you go there, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon, just so you see when we upload videos like this one and many more. We keep creating helpful tutorials. I have many of them scheduled to drop on this channel in a short while, so subscribe just so that we know we are creating helpful content for people. Head over to that video and I'm going to see you there. Until then, stay cool, stay humble.